It's a really great pleasure to be in Andres Romer's classroom. I believe that almost anyone can provide leadership in their family, in their neighborhood, in their school, in their community, or in their organization or country. I don't believe that leadership is the select domain of a few people with particular gifts. I know from my training in medicine and in music that very, very talented musicians, if they don't get the right training, will not become great artists. One needs great training in order to deploy one's own talents to the maximum. And I believe that almost anybody can provide leadership at the micro or at the macro level. Indeed, it's my guess that many of you have already practiced leadership and have reasons to celebrate the ways in which you've built the capacities of other people, be it in your family or neighborhood or organization. And it's also my guess that you have some of the wounds and scars on your backs from the times when you've tried to provide that leadership. Because leadership is not a safe and easy enterprise. It comes with risks. And sometimes people get neutralized or marginalized when they raise questions that other people don't want to address, when they generate information that people don't want to look at. For example, you heard a panel this morning addressing the problems of drug abuse. And we saw a wonderful debate that takes place here in Mexico, but should be taking place in my country, in the United States, and does not. Because any politician who even raises the question is at risk of committing political suicide. So some of the hardest questions in life that we need to address in our communities and in our country and in our organizations, some of the most wonderful opportunities that need to be seized, require us to have the courage to take risks, to engage people in believing in themselves, believing that they can create something that they didn't realize they could create before, in building new capacity. Leadership is not about generating dependency, even though many of us would like to be the go-to person, the magical person to whom everyone else turns. Leadership is not about building dependency, it's about building capacity. So what I'd like to do is share with you a few lessons that I've captured from listening to the stories of many people from all over the world who've tried to practice leadership, who've succeeded in wonderful ways, but also have failed, because nobody succeeds routinely. Everyone has a mixed record in the area of leadership. I've studied why people get brought down, how good-hearted people with an enormous amount of passion and innocence can be neutralized. And so I would like to share with you a few of these lessons in the hope that as you go out back to your lives this evening and tomorrow, after these 3 inspiring days in the schoolhouse that Andres Romer has helped to build with his colleagues, I hope these ideas will help you orient yourself through the dangers of change. The first idea is that it's very important to be able to get perspective in the midst of action, to be able to get off the dance floor where the music is beating fast, and to get up on the balcony from which you can look down on the dance floor and see what might be happening, to see the patterns of action. From the dance floor, all you can see are the people dancing close to you. But from the balcony, you might see all sorts of patterns, that some people are dancing when the music's fast, and other people are dancing when the music's slow. It's very important in leadership to be able to get on the balcony, even in the midst of a meeting, to be able to push your chair back a few inches and ask, what's really going on here? What am I missing? What's the song beneath the words? What values are at stake? Why are some people's eyes glazing over? Why are some people getting agitated? One needs to listen to all of those nonverbal cues and analyze what might be happening. You can then get back on the playing field, back on the dance floor, and make corrective action. That capacity to move from action to reflection, back to action, back to reflection, gives you the improvisational flexibility to be creative in an ongoing, changing environment. Many people think leadership's all about having a vision and then knowing the critical path to achieve that vision. All the rest then is a sales problem. But I think that idea of leadership is bankrupt and also generates heroic suicide. Because for the hard problems we face, there's a great deal of uncertainty in how to move forward. One has to improvise. It's more like playing jazz than classical music. So in order to have that improvisational flexibility, to keep asking, how have things changed? How do we need to deviate from the plan? To know that the plan is simply today's best guess on the future. That flexibility requires the capacity to gain perspective in the midst of action, to reflect in the midst of action. This skill is so essential that many of the major religious traditions have developed all sorts of spiritual practices to help us achieve that capacity. The Jesuits call it contemplation in action. The Buddhists call it mindfulness. The Hindus call it karma yoga. It's a simple idea, but it's difficult to do. So I encourage you to practice that capacity, to stop yourself for a moment, step back and ask what's going on, to develop the practice of debriefing at the end of the day, to take notes in a journal. But most important, to have partners, because the idea that you can lead by yourself is dangerous. One needs partners with whom to lead, people who can provide safe environments to grab you by the collar up to the balcony and say, let's debrief and take a look at what's just happened today. You have to have confidants, people who you can talk to like that. And one of the ways your confidants can help you is to help you distinguish yourself from your role. One of the big mistakes in leadership is people often confuse themselves with the role that they're in. And then they make the mistake of taking it personally when they're attacked or when they're idealized. But generally what comes at you is a product of the role that you're playing in other people's lives. This came home to me when I had lunch once with the King of Jordan. And we asked him, how did you prepare for being king? And he said, I didn't think I was going to be king, but my father, King Hussein, just before he died, he decided I should be the king instead of my uncle. Now, when I look back, I think maybe my whole life he was preparing me to be a king because he kept saying to me, my son, the moment you begin to believe that you are a king, you're in trouble. King Hussein knew that when people kissed his hand, they were not kissing him. They were kissing king. And when they were shooting bullets at him, which they did do frequently, they were not actually trying to kill him. They were trying to kill represented to them in his role as king. They were trying to silence the message. This becomes critically important because when you take it personally, your natural reflex will be to defend yourself at a personal level. Instead of listening carefully, why is this person upset? How am I challenging them? What losses are they worried that I'm asking them to suffer? How am I threatening their worldview? And once one identifies that, one can then move into action, working the problem where the problem is located, which is in the other person, not in you. Your partners can also help you listen. Most people, when they get taken down in leadership, they die with their mouths open. They die because they talk too much. They get taken down because they've spent too much time filling the space rather than listening carefully. So your partners can help you stop and ask questions, to bring you back to the elemental virtues that we all once had as children, of curiosity and compassion, to be able to understand, why is this person fighting so hard? You know, allies come cheap. They don't have a lot to lose. It's the opposition that has the most to lose. And therefore, they're the people who we need to hold most closely, who we need to understand most intimately, because they're the people who have the most to lose, and we then need to know how to engage with them to tolerate the potential losses they may need to sustain to move in a more successful way into the future. Finally, I want to suggest that staying alive requires the capacity to remember, what is the point of leadership in the first place? Why even engage in this enterprise that sometimes is hazardous and risky? The reason is because there's no greater source of meaning than to make a difference in other people's lives. There's no greater source of meaning than to find ways to live and love and build the capacity of other people to move on and go beyond themselves. But sometimes in that effort to make a difference, we buy into the myth of measurement. And we begin to calibrate the worth and the value of what we do in measurable terms. Of course, measurement is a profoundly powerful tool. In medicine, where I began my career, we save lives every day because you can measure all sorts of things about the body, blood chemistries, heart rate, and so forth. But measurement is also just a tool. Nobody can run a business without measuring things. But measurement doesn't capture the ultimate truth. Unfortunately, when we grow up in a world of measurement, we begin to believe that we ourselves and the good that we do can be measured. And then we begin to wonder, do we measure up? And then we begin to think that when we lose that big and important job, the next job has to be just as big and important. Otherwise, it's not worth doing. But I think the point of leadership is to make a difference in people's lives, and I don't think you can measure good. That came home to me several years ago when my children were young. And my father, who was one of the great brain surgeons of his era, had just retired from neurosurgery. And when my children were young and he had just retired, he decided he wanted to go back to a childhood hobby. He always loved looking at the stars. And he decided he wanted to introduce his grandchildren to gazing at the stars. So he went out and bought all the astronomy books he could find. But he didn't like any of them, so he wrote his own. He sent it off to a book publishing house that does a lot of astronomy books, Cambridge University Press. And they said, this is pretty good. So they paired him up with an illustrator from Holland and then published it. So years ago, when my children were young, my father's book just came out. And it was on a holiday that we call in the United States Halloween, where the children go into the neighborhood collecting candy. And on that evening, we invited to our home a young man, a school teacher, who had been living in our house a few years earlier when he was a student. We invited him back to the house. We hadn't seen him in a long time because we wanted him to enjoy being with the children. We wanted the children to see him again. At the end of this sweet evening in the neighborhood, when Rick, this young teacher, is standing in the entryway of our home, my parents were standing there. And I realized, I want to give Rick a copy of my father's astronomy book. So my father stands up, kind of smiling. You don't get to be a neurosurgeon without a little bit of self-pride. I go down and bring up a copy of my father's book, and I give it to Rick. Rick opens it up and sees that it's dedicated to all the grandchildren, including my two children by name. Rick then closes the book and he turns to my father and asks if he could borrow a pen. My father reaches into his jacket and he gives Rick a pen, and he expects Rick to ask him to sign the book. But that's not what Rick does. Rick gets down on his knee, he opens the book to the dedication page, and he asks my two children to sign the book. And so my young children, in 1-inch scrawl, diagonally across the page, they sign their first names. And as they sign their first names, I look up to my father, and I wonder, what is he feeling? And I see just the beginning of tears in his eyes. And I realize 40 years of saving lives could not be measured against the meaning of that moment. I don't believe that any of us, when we pass on and visit with the angels in heaven, that the angels will ask us, why did you create 32 jobs and not 82? Why did you teach 57 children how to read and not 104? Why did you save 75 lives and not 138? How come, Mr. Politician, you ended one war and not two? You can't ultimately measure good. The sages in my tradition, which is all of our tradition, the Jewish tradition, because Jesus was one of our very best boys, you save one life, you save the world. I believe many of you have already exercised wonderful leadership in making a difference in people's lives. And I think we stay alive and we stay in the game of life and leadership by rejoicing in the fruits of our labor, by reminding ourselves when we get stuck in thinking that the glass is half empty, reminding ourselves of the differences we make. And so that's what I would like to leave you with. A prayer that you help each other remember and rejoice in the fruits of your labor as you continue to learn and adjust and grow in your capacities to provide leadership in your families, in your communities, and in your society. May the force be with you.